it is pretty surreal. I never, you never think about when it'll end when you're starting out. You just wonder how long it'll last and what's coming next. And 16 years ago, I started as a professional, and I think I've been blessed to be able to play for so long and play with amazing players and for great teams as well. So, falling out in the semi-final of both the Heineken Cup and the Premiership was disappointing. And you never know when your last game is when you enter playoff rugby. But tonight's pretty special. You get to run out for the last time wearing the captain's sleeve and having a run out, for a pretty social game as well, and having a chance to literally, push the end button and start again somewhere else.
I was reading that your first love wasn't really rugby; it was more tennis. Dreams of Wimbledon, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, my brothers played rugby, my father played rugby, and I was brought up in what was pretty much known as the East Rand, which is sort of the Johannesburg, Boksburg area, and we were stationed right next door to a tennis club, and that's all I wanted to do. So I went and hit the ball against the wall for hours on end until my mother would shout and make me do my homework. And I did visions of grandeur, serving aces at Wimbledon one day. I used to love Ivan Lendl, and he used to cry every time he lost in the final of Wimbledon, which happened quite regularly in those days. And it was all I really did, and I never really had been exposed to team sports or rugby for that matter. We moved from a rural town of Rustenburg, and by that stage I'd already started getting a little bit bigger than my own peers. The serve and volley was starting to become less effective as well, and I was possibly more suited towards the front row of a rugby team. I would love to sit here and say if only I'd stuck with tennis, but something tells me at 120 kilos I probably wouldn't have had too many Wimbledon titles under my belt.
And you played for the South African under-21s in the 1999. It wasn't a World Cup then, but it was the forerunner of it. But you played tighthead, I believe.
Well, I played tighthead from day one, and pretty much how that worked out is the first day, I think I was 11 years old, which is quite late for a South African boy to start playing rugby. You normally start around 4 or 5 years old. And they did tallest to shortest and fattest to thinnest, and so I stood in the front of the fat guys, and they said, okay, well, you've got prop written all over you. So I started off as a prop and stayed that way. From the age of 11 I played prop all the way through to the age of 22. The reason why I think it came about that tighthead was all I played until 2001 was purely because Jake White came to me and said, John, there's not really a lot of hookers around. There are a lot of props. You probably will be a Springbok one day if you stick at it, but you could very much be a Springbok hooker, quite soon if you learned how to throw and try to adjust your game. And so the sign of that to a 22-year-old was, well, where do I start? So I started throwing balls and learned how to play hooker, and only played my first provincial game at hooker at the age of 22. Played for the Springboks 4 months later as a hooker.
You made your debut against Canada, but your first actual start was, I think, in Buenos Aires in front of 60,000 fans.
Yeah.
What are your memories of that day? Because that's a pretty intimidating ground.
There was a couple of things that made it even more sort of pressurized in terms of an occasion. I'd started as this young guy who was being mentored to become a hooker by a guy called Charles Marais, and had sat on the bench very comfortably, coming on every now and again with cameo appearances. And in the interim, the coach had changed from Nick Mallett to Harry Viljoen. And Harry Viljoen decided that it was now time for me to take on the responsibility of starting at number 2. And the first test match is in Buenos Aires. And Harry decides that it's a test match where we are not allowed to kick the ball at all. No kicking anywhere at any time. And the first 40 minutes was helter-skelter, and it was just frantic. And people always say, do you remember anything? And I don't, because I got knocked out in about 35 minutes. I took a knee to the head somewhere along the line, and I didn't know my name at half time, so I wasn't put back on the field for second half, thank goodness, because they were only allowed to relieve the pressure. So Percy Montgomery got the go-ahead from Jake, who was one of the assistants, to allow the first kick in the 73rd minute of the test match. So it ended okay. We just won, but it was a frantic test match, and certainly a massively intimidating start, but one that ended up being kept off at half-time after getting a knock to the head. But it's sort of, it didn't affect me the next week, but yeah, anything from there is less pressure, I suppose.
2003 Rugby World Cup, your first experience of a Rugby World Cup. Compared to 2007, of course, it didn't go very well. What stands out for that tournament for you? Was it just a very early experience with the pressures that come with it?
I mean, it was in vast contrast to 2007, but I didn't know what to compare it to. I think in defense of how poorly we performed and how badly we did and how early we exited the tournament, I think we possibly didn't have the best of players to choose from, which we normally do have an abundance of talent. And if you go through the squad that made it to Australia, there were some okay players, and there were some great players, but they were all 19, 20 years old, and the likes of Skalkberger, Jacques Fourie, etc. So it was, I suppose, the core of what was to come, but it was nowhere near ready for that kind of a challenge. I think at that stage, the ambition of those players was to get to a World Cup, was to play in a World Cup, and not to win a World Cup. And that, I suppose, is, therein lies a lot of how poorly we did, and such a huge amount of negativity around our preparation with Kampsdaldraad, and it's just a massively bad time for Springbok rugby, probably at an all-time low, when Jake did come in and asked me to be captain of the next era, which was daunting in itself. He sat me down and I just said, as long as you can promise it'll be better than this and better than what it's been. And he did make a promise, and he certainly stood up to it.